Our baby is coming soon, so we'll have to put you in a nursing home, my daughter-in-law said. After my response, the shrew simply fell out of her chair. My son went pale with the truth. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I was humming softly while folding Joshua's old baby clothes when Bella's voice cut through the quiet afternoon like a knife through silk. Our baby will be born soon. We'll have to put you in a nursing home. The tiny yellow onesie slipped from my hands and fluttered to the floor. I turned slowly, thinking I must have misheard her. Bella stood in the doorway of what had been my bedroom for the past 3 years, her hand resting on her 6-month pregnant belly, that familiar smirk playing on her lips. "Excuse me." My voice came out as barely a whisper. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning my belongings with the cool detachment of someone appraising items at a garage sale. "We need this room for the nursery, Donna. You understand, right? Family comes first." The irony wasn't lost on me. After 62 years on this earth, 34 of them as Joshua's mother, I was apparently no longer considered family. "Where is Joshua?" I asked, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the dresser. "He's at work, obviously. Someone has to support this family." Her tone carried that familiar condescension, the same one she'd used when explaining why I couldn't join them for their anniversary dinner last month, or why there wasn't room for me in their Christmas photos. I stared at her perfectly made-up face, her designer maternity clothes that cost more than my entire wardrobe. This was the same woman who had smiled sweetly at our first meeting 5 years ago, telling me how lucky Joshua was to have such a devoted mother. The same woman who had cried when I offered to move in to help after they bought this house, claiming she felt so blessed to have me close. "Bella, I don't understand. This is my home too." She laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Your home? Donna, let's be realistic. You live here out of Joshua's kindness. But we're starting our own family now and we need space. You've had a good run, but it's time to face facts." The room started spinning slightly. I sat down hard on my bed, the same bed where I'd slept restlessly for 3 years, listening to them argue about money through thin walls, pretending not to hear Bella's complaints about having me around. "I help around the house," I said weakly. "I cook, I clean, I take care of everything while you both work. And we appreciate that, we really do." Her voice took on that fake sweetness again. "But a nursing home will have people trained to take care of you properly. You're not getting any younger, and honestly it's getting harder to have you here. Harder to have me here." Each word was carefully chosen to wound. "I'm only 62, Bella. I'm not some invalid who needs round-the-clock care." She shrugged, examining her manicured nails. "Age is just a number, I suppose. But Joshua and I have discussed this extensively. We've already looked at several facilities. There's a nice one about 20 minutes away. They have bingo nights." Bingo nights. As if that would somehow compensate for being discarded by my own son. "Does Joshua know you're telling me this now? Like this?" "Of course he knows. We're a team, Donna. We make decisions together." She moved toward the window, looking out at the small garden I'd been tending. "Actually, we're thinking of turning this whole room into a beautiful nursery. Maybe a jungle theme, or something with clouds and stars. The baby will have such a lovely view of your little garden." My little garden. The one I'd planted and maintained. The one that had brought life and beauty to this house. The one they would now enjoy while I was warehoused somewhere with bingo nights and institutional food. "When?" The word scraped out of my throat. "Well, I'm 6 months along now, so we're thinking in the next month or so. That gives you time to adjust to the idea and get your things together." She spoke as if she were discussing weekend plans. Joshua thought it might be easier coming from me, woman to woman. The coward. My son, who I'd raised alone after his father left when he was 8, who I'd worked double shifts to put through college, couldn't even face me himself. He'd sent his wife to deliver the news like I was some tenant being evicted. "I see." I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. "And if I refuse?" Bella's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Well, that would be unfortunate. This is Joshua's house, after all. And as his wife, I have to think about what's best for our family. Our real family." There it was. The truth finally laid bare. I had never been part of their real family. I was a convenience when they needed help with household tasks, a burden when they wanted privacy, and now an obstacle to their perfect life. I think I need to lie down, I said quietly. Of course. This is a lot to process. Bella's voice returned to its sickeningly sweet tone. Take all the time you need. We're not monsters, Donna. We want this transition to be as smooth as possible for everyone. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Oh, and maybe don't mention this to Joshua when he gets home? He's been so stressed about work lately, and I'd hate for him to worry. We can discuss the details as a family this weekend. After she left, I sank back onto my bed and stared at the ceiling. The house felt different now, like the walls were closing in. Every stick of furniture, every picture on the walls, every comfortable routine I'd built here suddenly felt foreign, temporary. I thought about calling my sister Margaret in Florida. But what would I say? That I'd been naive enough to believe my son loved me enough to want me around? That I'd given up my own small apartment 3 years ago to help them, only to be discarded the moment I became inconvenient? The baby clothes lay scattered on the floor where I'd dropped them. Joshua's tiny shirts and sleepers that I'd saved for 34 years, hoping someday to share them with his children. Now they seemed like relics of a different life, evidence of a love that apparently hadn't been returned. As the afternoon light faded, I heard Joshua's car in the driveway. My heart hammered as I listened to his footsteps on the front porch, the jingle of his keys, the sound of the door closing. Would he come to see me? Would he explain? Apologize? Instead, I heard him greet Bella with enthusiasm, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they discussed their day. Not once did either of them mention my name. I realized then that tomorrow would bring no reprieve, no sudden change of heart. This wasn't a temporary disagreement or a moment of poor judgment. This was a carefully planned execution of everything I thought I knew about my place in their lives. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, something began to stir inside me. Not just hurt, not just shock, but something harder and more determined. They thought they knew who I was, what I was worth, what I had to offer. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. Every creak of the floorboards above reminded me that Joshua and Bella were up there, probably discussing nursery colors and baby names, while I faced the reality of being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. As dawn broke through my bedroom window, the one that would soon showcase Bella's jungle-themed nursery, memories came flooding back with painful clarity. I remembered the day I'd first walked into this house 3 years ago. Joshua had seemed genuinely excited, showing me around like a proud homeowner. "Mom, this could be perfect," he'd said, opening the door to what would become my room. "You could have your own space, but we'd still be together. Think of how much help you could be when we decide to have kids." Bella had been radiant that day, taking my arm and walking me through each room. "Donna, you have such good taste," she'd gushed, admiring the small decorative touches I'd brought from my apartment. "I hope you'll help me make this place feel like a real home." What a fool I'd been to believe her. I'd sold my small but comfortable apartment without hesitation. The money had gone straight into their down payment, though we'd never discussed it as a loan or investment. "Family helps family," I told Joshua when he'd tried to protest. "Besides, what do I need with my own place when I can be here with you?" The transition had been gradual, so subtle that I hadn't noticed the shift until it was too late. At first, Bella had been genuinely appreciative. She'd worked long hours at the marketing firm, and I'd taken over the cooking and cleaning gladly. It felt good to be needed, to contribute something meaningful to their lives. "You're a lifesaver, Donna," she'd say, coming home to find dinner ready and the house spotless. "I don't know what we'd do without you." But somewhere along the way, appreciation had turned to expectation. My contributions became invisible, assumed rather than acknowledged. When I'd catch a cold and couldn't cook for a few days, Bella would sigh dramatically about having to order takeout. When I'd ask if they wanted to try a different recipe for dinner, she'd remind me that they were simple people with simple tastes, and perhaps I shouldn't experiment so much. The morning coffee routine was a perfect example. Every single day for 3 years, I'd risen at 6:30 to make fresh coffee, squeeze orange juice, and prepare breakfast. Not once had either of them thanked me or even acknowledged that this didn't just happen by magic. When I'd overslept one Saturday morning due to a migraine, I'd woken to find Bella standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, staring at the empty coffee pot like it had personally offended her. "I guess we're on our own this morning," she'd said when I'd appeared, still in my robe and clearly unwell. That should have been my first real warning sign. Then there were the social gatherings. In the beginning, Bella would include me naturally. "Donna makes the most amazing lasagna," she'd tell their friends. "We're so lucky to have her cooking skills in the family." But gradually, I'd been relegated to the kitchen during dinner parties, emerging only to serve and clear dishes. Their friends would barely acknowledge my presence, treating me like hired help rather than Joshua's mother. The worst had been last Christmas. I'd spent 3 days preparing their traditional dinner, making all of Joshua's childhood favorites. The house had been filled with the warm sense of roasting turkey, homemade bread, and the special cranberry sauce recipe my own mother had taught me. Bella's parents had come, along with her sister and brother-in-law. I'd set the table for 8, including myself, but when everyone sat down, there had been only 7 place settings. "Oh, Donna," Bella had said sweetly, "would you mind eating in the kitchen? The dining room is a little crowded with everyone here." I'd stood there holding the bowl of mashed potatoes I just brought from the kitchen, looking at the table I'd spent an hour decorating with candles and my grandmother's good china. Joshua had avoided my eyes, focusing intently on his plate. "Of course," I'd said quietly, turning back toward the kitchen. "I understand." But I hadn't understood. Not then. Now, lying in my bed at 5:30 in the morning, I understood perfectly. I had been slowly but systematically erased from their family picture, reduced from Joshua's mother to a live-in housekeeper who worked for room and board. The financial aspect stung almost as much as the emotional rejection. 3 years ago, I'd had my own savings account, my own small nest egg built from years of careful budgeting and modest investments. Most of that had gone into their down payment, but I'd also been steadily contributing to household expenses without ever being asked. The grocery bills, the utility payments when they were short, the expensive repairs when their water heater had died last winter. I'd covered it all without complaint, telling myself it was what family did for each other. Meanwhile, Bella had continued her regular shopping trips, coming home with bags from expensive boutiques. "I found the most adorable dress for the office Christmas party," she'd announce, twirling in something that cost more than I spent on clothing in 6 months. Joshua said I deserved to treat myself after working so hard. Joshua had never suggested I deserved to treat myself. In fact, when I'd mentioned wanting to take a weekend trip to visit my sister Margaret in Florida, he'd frowned with concern. "Can we afford that right now, Mom? Things are pretty tight with the mortgage and everything." Things were tight for me, apparently. Never for them. The cruelest cut had been watching Joshua change. My sweet boy, who used to call me every Sunday when he lived across town, who used to bring me flowers on Mother's Day, who used to ask for my advice about everything from job interviews to relationship problems. Bella had slowly but effectively built a wall between us, painting me as an intrusive mother-in-law who didn't understand boundaries. "Your mom means well," I'd overheard her tell him one evening, "but she's having trouble accepting that you're not her little boy anymore. It's kind of sad, really. Sad." My love for my son had been reframed as pathological. My desire to be part of his life transformed into an inability to let go. Now, as morning light filled my room, I could see the situation with crystal clarity. This wasn't a sudden decision brought on by the pregnancy. This was the final step in a carefully orchestrated plan to remove me from their lives. Bella had been building toward this moment for 3 years, slowly isolating me, making me financially dependent, ensuring that when the time came, I'd have nowhere else to go. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. I rose from my bed and walked to the old oak dresser that had belonged to my mother. In the bottom drawer, beneath winter sweaters I rarely wore, my fingers found what I was looking for. A thick manila envelope, the edges worn from years of handling. Inside were documents Bella knew nothing about. Papers that would change everything. As I heard movement upstairs and smelled the first hints of coffee brewing, I smiled for the first time in 24 hours. Let them enjoy their morning routine. Let Bella continue planning her perfect nursery. They had no idea what was coming. The manila envelope felt heavier in my hands than it should have, weighted with secrets I'd kept for 15 long years. I settled into the old rocking chair by my window, the one I'd brought from my apartment, and carefully opened the worn flap. The first document was a deed. Not just any deed, but the deed to this very house, bearing my name in elegant script. Donna Marie Fletcher, sole owner. Below it, a stack of mortgage payment receipts, all made from my personal account. Every single monthly payment for the past 3 years, plus the original down payment, had come from my money. Joshua had no idea. The story began with my late husband Robert's death 15 years ago. Everyone knew about the life insurance policy, the modest $25,000 that had helped me stay afloat during those first difficult months of widowhood. What nobody knew was about Robert's other investments, the ones he'd made quietly over our 30-year marriage without ever mentioning them to me. "Mrs. Fletcher," the attorney had said during that overwhelming week after the funeral, "there are some additional assets we need to discuss. Your husband was quite the conservative investor, it seems." Conservative was an understatement. Robert had been secretly purchasing rental properties in emerging neighborhoods, reinvesting the profits year after year. By the time of his death, he owned 4 small apartment buildings and had accumulated a portfolio worth nearly $400,000. I'd been stunned into silence. My husband, who had clipped coupons and driven the same pickup truck for 12 years, had been quietly building wealth I never dreamed existed. "He left specific instructions," the attorney had continued, sliding another document across his mahogany desk. "He wanted you to maintain the properties quietly. His words were, 'Let Donna live simply but never want for anything.' Quite romantic, actually. So I had. For 15 years, I'd collected rental income while living modestly, watching my son struggle with his own financial challenges, waiting for the right moment to help without creating dependency. The rental properties had been well managed by a property management company, generating steady income that I'd hardly touched. When Joshua had fallen in love with this house 3 years ago, I'd seen my opportunity. The asking price was $250,000, well within my means but completely beyond his young couple's budget. He'd been heartbroken when their initial offer was rejected, devastated when they'd lost their backup choice to a cash buyer. "I don't know what we're going to do, Mom," he'd said that evening, sitting in my small apartment kitchen with his head in his hands. "Bella's heart is set on having a real home before we start trying for kids. But everything decent is so expensive, and with both our student loans." I'd made the decision that very night. I would buy the house myself and let them live in it, contributing to their happiness while ensuring my own security. It had seemed perfect at the time. The next morning, I'd called the seller's agent and made a cash offer $10,000 above asking price. When it was accepted, I told Joshua I'd found a way to help with their down payment, letting him assume I'd liquidated some small savings account. "Mom, I can't let you do that," he protested. "That's your security." "Nonsense," I'd replied. "What good is security if I can't help my family when they need it? Besides, we'll work out some kind of arrangement. Maybe I could move in and help around the house." The suggestion had been mine, but it had solved multiple problems. Joshua and Bella got their dream home. I got to be close to my son, and I retained ownership of a valuable asset while appearing to be the grateful mother living on her children's charity. Except somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I was the one doing the favor. The property management company had continued handling my rental income, depositing it into an account Joshua knew nothing about. Over the past 3 years, while I'd been playing the role of dependent mother-in-law, I'd accumulated nearly $70,000 in liquid savings on top of my existing investments. I spread the documents across my small desk, running my fingers over official seals and signatures. The deed was registered in my name alone. The property taxes were paid from my account. The homeowner's insurance listed me as the sole policyholder. Legally, undeniably, this house belonged to me. Joshua and Bella had been living in my house, treating me like an unwelcome guest, planning to ship me off to a nursing home so they could enjoy my property in peace. The irony was almost poetic. I gathered the papers carefully and returned them to the envelope, my mind racing with possibilities. For 3 years, I'd watched Bella redecorate my house according to her tastes, buying expensive furniture and accessories while complaining about money being tight. I'd watched her invite her friends over to admire their beautiful home, while I served refreshments from the kitchen like hired help. Just last month, she'd spent nearly $3,000 on new living room furniture, charging it to a credit card that Joshua worried about constantly. "We really need to be more careful with spending," I'd heard him tell her through the thin walls. "The mortgage is already stretching us pretty thin." If only he knew there was no mortgage to stretch them. The house had been paid for in cash 3 years ago. The monthly payments they thought they were making to the bank were actually going into an escrow account I'd established to maintain the illusion. I'd planned to surprise them with the truth eventually, maybe as a wedding gift or when they had their first child. Instead, they were planning to discard me like garbage. I walked to my bedroom window and looked out at the garden I'd planted and tended for 3 years. It wasn't just my little garden, as Bella had so dismissively called it. It was my garden in my yard on my property. Every flower, every vegetable, every carefully pruned shrub had been planted by the legal owner of this land. The morning sun caught the blooms on the roses I'd transplanted from my apartment's small balcony. Those roses had been a wedding gift from Robert 40 years ago, and I'd carried them with me through every move, every change of circumstance. They'd survived because they belonged to someone who truly cared for them. Unlike some other things in this house, apparently. I heard movement upstairs and checked the small clock on my nightstand. 7:15. Bella would be getting ready for work, probably already planning how to redecorate my room into her perfect nursery. Joshua would be grabbing coffee and rushing out the door, avoiding any awkward conversations about their decision to dispose of his mother. Let them enjoy their routines a little longer. Let Bella continue making plans for renovations she couldn't afford in a house she didn't own. Let Joshua continue worrying about mortgage payments that didn't exist. I had some planning of my own to do. The first call I made was to Martin Rodriguez, my property manager. I'd spoken to him monthly for 3 years, but always from my old cell phone, always when Joshua and Bella were both at work. He'd been handling my affairs so efficiently that I'd barely needed to think about the business side of my life. Mrs. Fletcher. His familiar voice came through clearly. How are you this morning? I'm well, Martin. I need to ask you about the house on Maple Street. The one I'm currently living in. Of course. Beautiful property. The property management company I recommended has been excellent. Haven't they? No issues with the arrangement at all. Actually, there's been a change in circumstances. I may need to formalize some things. Could you have your attorney contact me about tenant rights and eviction procedures in this state? There was a pause. Eviction procedures? Are the tenants causing problems? I smiled grimly. You could say that. After hanging up, I sat back in my chair and looked around the room that Bella was so eager to transform. She thought she was getting rid of an inconvenient old woman who had nowhere else to go. She thought she was claiming space in a house that belonged to her husband. She thought she held all the cards. As I heard Joshua's car backing out of the driveway and Bella's heels clicking across the hardwood floors above, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete control over my own destiny. They wanted to play games with family loyalty? They wanted to treat me like an unwelcome burden while living off my generosity? Fine. But this game was about to have some new rules. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in deception, though I wasn't the one doing the deceiving. I watched with growing amazement as Bella and Joshua performed their carefully choreographed dance around the elephant in the room, pretending that nothing had changed while making increasingly obvious preparations for my departure. The morning after my conversation with Martin Rodriguez, I decided to act exactly as I had before. I rose at 6:30, made coffee, prepared breakfast, and went about my daily routines as if Bella had never delivered her crushing ultimatum. But now I was watching everything through different eyes, seeing patterns I'd been blind to before. Bella had become almost giddy with excitement, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of concern for my well-being. She'd started making comments about how difficult it must be for someone my age to manage stairs, how tiring housework could become for seniors, how important it was for older people to have professional care available. I was reading an article about active senior communities, she'd announced over dinner on Wednesday, sliding a colorful brochure across the table. They have such wonderful amenities. Exercise classes, social activities, even transportation to shopping centers. Joshua had barely glanced at the brochure, but I'd picked it up and examined it carefully. Sunny Vista Senior Living. Monthly fees starting at $4,000. For $4,000 a month, I could have a tiny studio apartment, institutional meals, and supervised activities designed to keep the elderly occupied until they died. It looks very nice, I'd said mildly, watching Bella's face light up. Quite expensive, though. Oh, don't worry about that, she'd replied quickly. We've already spoken to the social worker there. There are programs to help with costs. Financial assistance for families who qualify. Financial assistance. Medicaid, she meant. She wanted me to impoverish myself to qualify for government aid so they wouldn't have to contribute to my care. The woman living in my house, sleeping in my second bedroom, planning to redecorate my property, wanted me to become a charity case rather than acknowledge any responsibility for my welfare. That's very thoughtful of you both, I'd said, folding the brochure neatly. Joshua had finally looked up from his plate, and I'd caught something in his expression that might have been shame, or maybe just indigestion. The house tour had been even more illuminating. 2 days later, Bella had invited her mother and sister over for lunch, ostensibly to get their opinions on nursery decorating. I'd prepared a lovely meal as always, then retreated to my room when they'd made it clear this was a family discussion. But the walls in this house were thin, and sound carried beautifully. The room has such potential, Bella's mother had gushed. With the right furniture and some fresh paint, it could be absolutely gorgeous. I'm thinking of knocking out part of this wall, Bella had replied, and I'd heard footsteps moving around my room. Open it up to create more space. Maybe add a built-in changing station here. They were planning to renovate my bedroom, not just redecorate it but actually alter the structure of my house. I'd pressed my ear closer to the wall, fascinated by the scope of their presumption. What about storage? Bella's sister had asked. Oh, we'll gut the whole room. New closet system, new flooring, maybe even new windows. I want everything to be perfect. New windows. I calculated quickly in my head. The renovations they were discussing would cost at least $20,000, possibly more. Money they didn't have, for a room in a house they didn't own, to benefit a baby who would grow up never knowing that his grandmother had been discarded to make room for his nursery. It's going to be expensive, Bella's mother had said, voicing my own thoughts. We'll manage, Bella had replied confidently. Joshua's been talking about taking out a home equity loan. With property values in this neighborhood, we should be able to access plenty of equity. A home equity loan. On my house. Using my property as collateral to fund renovations I hadn't approved. I'd sat down hard on my bed, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of it. Later that evening, I'd overheard Joshua on the phone with someone from the bank. He'd been in the kitchen, speaking in low tones, but sound carried both ways in this house. Yes, I understand I'll need to provide documentation of ownership, he'd said. The deed should be sufficient, right? And recent tax records. I'd smiled grimly. He was going to get quite a surprise when he requested those documents. The pattern continued throughout the week. Bella had started shopping online for nursery furniture, leaving browser windows open on the family computer, as if she wanted me to see her selections. Cribs that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Changing tables that were pricier than my car payment used to be. A rocking chair that would have covered my grocery budget for 3 months. I know it seems expensive, she told Joshua one evening, but we want only the best for our baby. We can afford it, especially once we're not supporting your mother anymore. Supporting me. The woman eating food I'd bought, living in a house I'd paid for, planning renovations with money she expected to borrow against my property, thought she was supporting me. The most revealing moment had come on Friday afternoon. I'd been in the laundry room folding towels when I'd heard Bella on the phone with one of her friends. Oh, Sarah, you have no idea what a relief this is going to be, she'd said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin door. Having her here has been such a strain. I mean, I know Joshua loves his mother, but she's just so present, you know? Always underfoot. Always watching everything we do. Always underfoot. In my own house. And the thing is, Bella had continued, she acts like she's doing us some huge favor by being here. Like we should be grateful she's cooking and cleaning. But honestly, I'd rather pay for a maid service than have her hovering around all the time. A maid service. That's what I'd been reduced to in her mind. Hired help who was getting above herself by expecting basic human courtesy. The best part, she'd gone on, is that once she's in the nursing home we'll finally have privacy. Real privacy. We can make this house exactly what we want it to be, without having to consider her feelings about every little change. Her feelings. As if my feelings about my own house were some minor inconvenience to be worked around. I know it sounds terrible, Bella had said, and I'd heard her moving around the living room, probably admiring the expensive furniture she'd bought with credit cards, but I can't wait to have our own space. Just Joshua and me and the baby. A real family. A real family. Apparently, I'd never been part of that equation. That evening, I'd made Joshua's favorite dinner. Pot roast with all the trimmings, the same meal I'd prepared for his birthday every year since he was 12. I'd set the table with my good china, lit candles and arranged flowers from the garden. If this was to be one of our last meals together as a family, I wanted it to be memorable. "This is lovely, Mom," Joshua had said, though he'd barely met my eyes. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble," I'd replied. "I enjoy cooking for you." Bella had remained silent throughout most of the meal, texting on her phone and picking at her food. Finally, she'd looked up with that bright, artificial smile I'd come to know so well. "Donna, I've been thinking about what we discussed earlier this month. About your future, I mean." "Oh, well, I know change can be frightening at our age," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But I really think this could be a wonderful opportunity for you. A chance to meet new people, try new activities. Really embrace this new chapter in your life." Embrace this new chapter. As if being abandoned by my family was some kind of personal growth opportunity. "That's very thoughtful of you, dear," I'd said, cutting another piece of roast. "I'm sure whatever happens will work out exactly as it should." Something in my tone must have caught her attention, because she'd paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" I'd smiled serenely. "Oh, just that life has a way of surprising you. People think they know how things are going to go, but sometimes the story takes an unexpected turn." Joshua had finally looked directly at me, frowning slightly. "Mom, are you feeling okay? You seem different lately." "Do I? I feel exactly like myself." I'd reached for the water pitcher, refilling everyone's glasses. "Perhaps more like myself than I have in quite some time." Later, as I cleaned up the dinner dishes, I'd heard them whispering in the living room. They'd been too quiet for me to make out individual words, but the tone had been unmistakably concerned. They sensed something had changed, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what. Good. Let them wonder. That night, I'd called Martin Rodriguez again. "I think it's time to move forward with those legal consultations we discussed," I told him. "How quickly can we arrange a meeting? I can have someone at your house Monday morning, if that works for you." Monday morning. While Joshua and Bella were both at work, blissfully unaware that their carefully constructed plans were about to crumble around them. "Perfect," I'd said. "And Martin? Make sure they bring multiple copies of all the documentation. I have a feeling I'm going to need them." As I'd hung up the phone, I'd felt lighter than I had in years. For too long, I'd been reacting to other people's decisions about my life. It was time to start making some decisions of my own. The meeting with the attorney had taken place Monday morning, exactly as planned. David Chun had arrived at 9:30 sharp, a serious man in his 50s with a briefcase full of documents that would change everything. We'd sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Bella had delivered her ultimatum 2 weeks earlier, and reviewed every piece of evidence of my ownership. "This is all very straightforward, Mrs. Fletcher," he'd said, examining the deed one final time. "You are the sole legal owner of this property. If you want the current occupants to leave, we can begin eviction proceedings immediately." "I don't want them to leave," I'd said quietly. "I want them to understand exactly what their situation really is." By Wednesday I was ready. I'd spent Tuesday watching Bella make phone calls to contractors, getting estimates for her elaborate nursery renovation. She'd scheduled 3 different consultations for later in the week, each one more expensive than the last. The woman was planning to spend $30,000 renovating my house without my permission, using money she expected to borrow against my property. The irony was delicious. That evening she'd outdone herself. She'd invited her parents and sister over for dinner, ostensibly to celebrate reaching her 7-month milestone in the pregnancy. But I'd seen the real agenda the moment they'd arrived, carrying samples of paint and fabric, armed with measuring tapes and decorating magazines. "We thought it would be fun to do some planning," Bella had announced as I'd served the appetizers I'd spent all afternoon preparing. "Get everyone's input on the nursery design." Everyone's input. Everyone except the person who actually owned the house they were planning to redesign. I'd retreated to the kitchen after serving the main course, listening to their excited chatter through the doorway. They'd spread their materials across my dining room table, the same table where I'd eaten countless lonely meals while they'd entertained their friends in the living room. "I think we should definitely go with the safari theme," Bella's mother had said. "It's so gender neutral, and you could do such cute things with lions and elephants." "The contractor said we could knock out part of this wall," Bella had added, and I'd heard footsteps moving toward my bedroom. "Open up the space and add built-in storage. It'll be like a completely different room." A completely different room. My room. In my house. "What about Donna?" Bella's sister had asked quietly. "Won't she mind having construction going on while she's still here?" There had been a moment of silence, then Bella's laugh, sharp and dismissive. "Oh, she won't be here much longer. We found her a lovely place at Sunny Vista. Much better for someone her age, really. Professional care, activities designed for seniors, people her own age to socialize with." "When is she moving?" Bella's father had asked. "Next month if everything goes according to plan. The social worker said there might be an opening in their Medicaid wing. It's not as nice as the private rooms, but honestly at her age, how much space does she really need?" Their Medicaid wing. They weren't just planning to warehouse me in a nursing home, they were planning to make me a charity case to do it. The woman who'd been living rent-free in my house for 3 years, eating food I'd bought and prepared, enjoying utilities I'd paid for, thought I should be grateful for a shared room in the poorest section of an institutional care facility. That's when I decided it was time. I'd walked calmly from the kitchen to the dining room, where they'd been spread around my table like generals planning a military campaign. The silence had been immediate and complete. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I'd said pleasantly, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about the renovations." Bella had flushed slightly, but her smile had remained fixed in place. "Oh, Donna, we were just brainstorming some ideas. Nothing definite yet." "Of course not," I'd agreed. "After all, you wouldn't want to make definite plans for renovations without consulting the homeowner first." "Naturally," her father had said with a chuckle, "though I'm sure Joshua would be happy to consider any suggestions you might have." "Joshua doesn't need to consider my suggestions," I'd said, my voice still pleasant and conversational. "This is my house." The silence that had followed was different from the first one. This one had weight to it, confusion and the first stirrings of alarm. "Your house," Bella had repeated slowly. "Yes, dear. My house. I own it." I'd watched the color drain from Bella's face as the words sank in. Her mother had looked confused, glancing between us as if waiting for someone to explain the joke. Her sister had frowned, still holding a fabric sample in her trembling hand. "That's not possible," Bella had whispered. "Joshua owns this house. We bought it 3 years ago." "Actually, I bought it 3 years ago," I'd said, walking to the sideboard where I'd placed David Chen's folder. "With cash. As a gift to my son and his wife, though I retained ownership to ensure my own security. Here's the deed if you'd like to see it." I'd spread the documents across the table, pushing aside paint samples and fabric swatches. Official seals, legal signatures, property tax records, insurance documents, all bearing my name as the sole owner of the property they'd been treating as their personal kingdom. Bella had stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Her hands had been shaking as she'd picked up the deed, reading my name over and over again. "This can't be right," she'd said, her voice getting higher and more strained. "You live here because we let you. You're supposed to be grateful. You're supposed to need us." "I've never needed you, Bella. You've needed me. You've been living in my house, eating food I've bought, enjoying a lifestyle you couldn't afford on your own salaries. And now you want to ship me off to a charity-funded nursing home, so you can continue enjoying my generosity without the inconvenience of my presence." The transformation had been remarkable. Bella's carefully maintained composure had cracked like an eggshell. Her face had turned red, then pale, then red again. She'd gripped the edge of the table, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "You're lying," she'd said desperately. "This is some kind of trick. Some kind of fraud." "The only fraud here," I'd said quietly, "has been pretending that I was dependent on you when the truth was exactly the opposite." That's when she'd started to stand up, her movements jerky and uncontrolled. The chair had caught behind her legs, and she'd stumbled backward, grabbing for the table. But her sweaty palms had slipped on the polished wood, and she'd gone down hard, landing on the hardwood floor with a crash that had echoed through the house. The silence that had followed had been deafening. Her mother had rushed to help her up, but Bella had just sat there on my floor, staring at the deed that had fluttered down beside her. Her perfect makeup was smeared, her expensive maternity dress wrinkled and askew. For the first time since I'd known her, she'd looked exactly like what she was. A frightened young woman who just realized she'd been living in a fantasy. "Bella, honey, are you hurt?" her sister had asked, kneeling beside her. But Bella hadn't answered. She just kept staring at those documents, her mouth moving silently as if she were trying to work out a math problem that didn't add up. "I think," her father had said carefully, "that we should probably head home and let you all work this out as a family." Family. The word had hung in the air like a question mark. They'd helped Bella to her feet and gathered their decorating supplies in awkward silence. The paint samples and fabric swatches that had seemed so important 15 minutes earlier now looked like the pathetic props they'd always been. Evidence of plans made by people who'd had no right to make them. As they'd prepared to leave, Bella's mother had paused at the door. "Donna," she'd said quietly, "I hope you know we never meant any disrespect." "Of course not," I'd replied. "You had no way of knowing the truth." Bella made sure of that. After they'd left, I'd cleaned up the dining room, folding the legal documents carefully and returning them to their folder. The house had felt different somehow, as if the air itself had changed. The oppressive weight of pretending to be grateful for charity I'd never needed had lifted completely. I'd been washing the dinner dishes when I'd heard Joshua's car in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I'd watched him walk up the front path, his shoulders set in that familiar way that meant he was preparing for an unpleasant conversation. The front door had closed with unusual force, and I'd heard his footsteps crossing the living room with purposeful strides. When he'd appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face had been flushed and his jaw tight. "Mom," he'd said without preamble, "we need to talk." I dried my hands carefully on the dish towel, taking my time. "Of course, dear. How was your day?" "Don't." His voice had been sharp, angrier than I'd heard it in years. "Bella called me at work. She was hysterical. Something about deeds and ownership and you claiming to own this house." "I don't claim to own this house, Joshua. I do own this house." The words had hit him like a physical blow. He'd actually taken a step backward, his face going pale. "That's impossible." "Is it? Think about it, son. 3 years ago, you and Bella were turned down for every mortgage you applied for. Your combined income wasn't enough, your credit wasn't established enough, your savings weren't sufficient for a decent down payment. Then suddenly, miraculously, you were able to buy this house with cash. Where exactly did you think that money came from?" I'd watched the realization dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. "You said you were helping with the down payment. You never said you were buying the whole house." "I never said I wasn't." He'd run his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd remembered from his childhood when he'd been caught in some mischief. "This doesn't make sense. Why would you let us think we owned it? Why would you live here like a dependent mother-in-law who should be grateful for your charity?" The question had hung between us, heavy with 3 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. "Mom, that's not how we saw you." "Isn't it? Then tell me, Joshua. When were you planning to let me know about your decision to put me in a nursing home? When were you going to discuss this major life change with me, instead of simply informing me it was happening?" His silence had been answer enough. As I'd watched my son stand there in my kitchen, struggling to process the complete reversal of everything he believed about our family dynamics, I'd felt something I hadn't expected. I'd felt sorry for him, but not sorry enough to pretend anymore that I was anything other than exactly who I'd always been. A woman who'd loved her family enough to give them everything, and who'd finally learned the difference between giving and being taken from. The conversation with Joshua had lasted until nearly midnight. We'd sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Bella had delivered her ultimatum 3 weeks earlier, and laid everything bare. Every assumption, every misunderstanding, every moment of resentment that had built up over 3 years of living a lie. "I don't understand," he'd said for the 4th time. Why didn't you tell me? Why let us think we were supporting you when it was the other way around? I poured myself another cup of tea, choosing my words carefully. Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought you held all the power. I wanted to know if the son I'd raised would protect me or abandon me when I became inconvenient. The truth had been harsh, but it had needed saying. And now I know. Joshua had flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair, Mom. We weren't abandoning you. We were trying to make sure you got proper care. Proper care in a Medicaid facility. While you renovated my house with money, you planned to borrow against my property. I kept my voice level, factual. Care that would have cost me everything I'd saved while costing you nothing. He'd opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was no argument to be made because we both knew it was true. The weeks that had followed had been a delicate dance of renegotiation. Bella had barely spoken to me since the night she'd discovered the truth, spending most of her time at her mother's house or locked in their bedroom. When she did emerge, she'd moved through my house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary. Joshua, to his credit, had tried to bridge the gap. He'd apologized, genuinely and repeatedly, for the nursing home plan. He'd acknowledged that they'd taken my contributions for granted and treated me poorly. He'd even suggested that maybe they should look for their own place, give everyone a fresh start. That's when I'd surprised him again. I don't want you to leave, I'd said. This house is big enough for all of us, including the baby. But things are going to change. And they had. The first change was financial transparency. I'd shown Joshua the real numbers, the rental income that had been supporting their lifestyle, the property taxes and insurance I'd been paying, the true cost of maintaining the household they'd thought they were providing for me. My God, he'd whispered, staring at the bank statements. We've been living way above our means this whole time. Yes, you have. But you don't have to anymore, as long as we're clear about the arrangement. The new arrangement was simple. They could continue living in my house, but as tenants, not owners. They would pay reasonable rent, contribute to utilities and household expenses, and treat me with the respect due to their landlord and Joshua's mother. The expensive credit card purchases would stop. The grand renovation plans would be scaled back to realistic improvements that I approved and that they could actually afford. Most importantly, all major decisions about the house, about our living situation, about anything that affected me directly, would be made as a family with my input carrying equal weight. Bella had fought the new rules initially, raging about fairness and manipulation and how I was destroying their dreams. But when Joshua had quietly pointed out that their alternative was finding their own place on their combined salaries, she'd gradually accepted reality. The second change was more personal. Respect. No more eating my meals in the kitchen while they entertained in the dining room. No more being excluded from family gatherings in my own home. No more condescending comments about what was appropriate for someone my age, or what I should be grateful for. No more assumptions about my capabilities, my needs, or my future. I was Donna Fletcher, homeowner and head of household, not a charity case tolerated out of Joshua's misguided sense of obligation. The transformation had been remarkable to watch. Without the constant financial pressure they hadn't even realized they were under, Joshua had relaxed in ways I hadn't seen since his college days. He'd started coming home for lunch sometimes, sitting in the garden and telling me about his work, asking for my advice on problems he was facing. Bella's adjustment had been harder, but even she had begun to find her footing in our new reality. Without the stress of maintaining appearances she couldn't afford, she'd started to show glimpses of the person she might have been if she hadn't been so focused on projecting success. She'd even thanked me, awkwardly but genuinely, when I'd helped her through a particularly difficult evening of morning sickness. The baby's room had been decorated simply but beautifully, with furniture chosen for comfort and practicality, rather than status. The crib I'd bought was sturdy and safe, the changing table was functional, and the rocking chair was the same one I'd used when Joshua was born, refinished and reupholstered as my gift to my grandchild. It wasn't the $30,000 designer nursery Bella had originally envisioned, but it was filled with love instead of credit card debt. Now, as I sat in that rocking chair at 3 a.m, holding my 2-week-old grandson Daniel, I reflected on how much had changed in the 6 months since Bella's ultimatum. The little boy in my arms was perfect, with Joshua's dark hair and what looked like it might be my late husband's stubborn chin. He'd arrived 2 weeks early, keeping us all on our toes, but he was healthy and beautiful and completely unaware of the family drama that had preceded his birth. Bella was sleeping peacefully in the next room, finally getting some rest after a difficult first week of new motherhood. The exhaustion and hormonal changes had softened her sharp edges somewhat, and she'd begun to lean on me in ways she never had before. When Daniel had colic and wouldn't stop crying, she'd brought him to me with tears in her eyes, admitting she didn't know what to do. "I don't know how to be a mother," she'd whispered, placing the screaming infant in my experienced arms. "What if I'm terrible at this?" I'd walk Daniel around the house, humming the same lullabies I'd sung to Joshua 34 years earlier, until he'd finally settled into sleep. "You're not terrible," I'd told her quietly. "You're learning." We all had to learn. It had been the first real conversation we'd had since the night of her dramatic fall, and it had marked the beginning of something that might eventually become a genuine relationship. Joshua had thrown himself into fatherhood with touching enthusiasm. He'd taken 2 weeks off work and spent most of his time hovering over Daniel's crib, marveling at tiny fingers and toes. He'd already started a college fund, modest but consistent, and had begun talking about converting part of the basement into a playroom for when Daniel got older. "I want to be a better father than I was a son," he'd told me one evening as we'd watched the sunset from the front porch. "You were a wonderful son," I'd replied. "You just got a little lost along the way." "I'm sorry, Mom. For all of it. For treating you like you were in the way instead of the reason we had a way at all." The apology had been a long time coming, but it had been worth waiting for. As Daniel stirred in my arms, making the soft snuffling sounds that all babies make in their sleep, I thought about the future. Not the one Bella had planned, where I would waste away in an institutional facility while they lived in my house and spent my money. Not the one I had feared, where I would be discarded by the only family I had left. This future was better than either of those alternatives. It was messier, more complicated, requiring constant communication and compromise. But it was real in a way our previous arrangement never had been. The house was still mine, but it was home to all of us. The financial responsibility was shared fairly, but the emotional bonds were stronger. The power dynamics had shifted, but love had grown in the spaces where resentment used to live. Most importantly, Daniel would grow up knowing all of his family. He would know that his grandmother owned the house he lived in, that she had chosen to share it with him out of love rather than obligation. He would learn that families work best when everyone contributes according to their abilities and everyone is valued for who they are, not just what they can provide. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside Daniel's window, I heard Joshua's footsteps in the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep, checking on his son with the dedication of a new father. "He's been sleeping peacefully," I whispered. "Just finished his bottle." Joshua crossed the room quietly and kissed the top of Daniel's head, then mine. "Thank you, Mom. For everything. For this house, for your patience with us. For being here when we needed you even though we didn't deserve it. You're my family," I said simply. "All of you. This is where you belong." As I placed Daniel gently in his crib and watched Joshua tuck the blankets around his son, I realized that Bella had been right about one thing that night 3 weeks ago. Our baby was going to be born soon, and changes did need to be made. Just not the changes she'd had in mind. The changes we'd made were better. They were built on truth instead of deception, on respect instead of condescension, on love instead of obligation. They acknowledged that families are complicated, that power isn't always what it appears to be, and that sometimes the people who seem the most powerless are actually the strongest of all. I had learned that I didn't need anyone's permission to take up space in my own life. Joshua had learned that true strength comes from acknowledging your mistakes and working to do better. Bella was learning that security isn't about controlling other people, but about building relationships based on mutual respect. And Daniel would learn, as he grew up in this house that was truly a home, that families take many forms but the best ones are built on a foundation of honesty, kindness, and the radical idea that everyone deserves to be valued for who they are. As I made my way back to my own room, the same room Bella had been so eager to transform into a nursery, I smiled at the early morning light streaming through windows that looked out on the garden I'd planted and tended for 3 years. My garden in my yard, in my house, surrounded by my family. It had taken a long time, but we'd finally gotten the rules right.